Hi again, everyone. Good afternoon or good night, depending on where you may be. Good morning, depending on where you may be, right? Anyway, here I am about to do another video. I've done a few in the past few days after going like 6 months without posting any. Well, here's another video. And before I start, I want to thank you guys who have been watching the videos, who've joined the channel, who have been communicating, I should say commenting. For those of you with your encouraging words, um, those of you with your well wishes and your warm welcome and all of that, I really, really do appreciate it. Those of you who have been sharing information with me, um, thank you. I truly, truly, truly appreciate it. I know this is not a channel with millions of subscribers and so forth, but for those of you who have been here so far, I am more than thankful for your comments and you helping out, trying to help, offering information. I want to also send a special thanks to my cousin, who you may have seen in here, Duarte, um, who has come in and put some information in. I have learned so much from him. And in case you may not know who he is, he happens to be a family member, believe it or not, someone we met in Madeira. And prior to our trip to Madeira, he didn't know we existed, and we didn't know he existed. Initially, it turned out that there is a connection between him and my wife through perhaps two brothers or two cousins from way back when. I guess one side of that family stayed in Madeira, whereas the other side, at least one representative, traveled to Guyana, or British Guyana back in those days, and he produced, I think, a son, maybe some other children, and through that son, my wife's maternal grandmother comes through that son. So that explains that part of it. So Duarte was someone that is connected to her through that side. But it also turns out that he's apparently also connected to me. Okay? But I guess I'll get to that a little further down. But I want to thank you for tuning in and for listening in, and I hope I can make this as interesting as possible. I know these videos are not all splashy with all sorts of graphics and so forth. I'm just talking to you guys, and I'm hoping that I am keeping your interest just by me babbling on, and I try to make it as interesting as possible. I try to be as eloquent as I possibly can be, and I try to be as clear. It doesn't mean I'm always going to say things that are correct. I may be off in my information, but I try my best to bring the most accurate of information I can possibly bring. So, as you know, and I've said it practically in every video, that I was born in St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But yet here I am speaking about an island 3,000 miles or 2,500 miles, 2,800 miles across the Atlantic Ocean away from the U.S. Virgin Islands. I'm talking about this island. I'm talking about family that came from this island. And while that is not exactly rare, I mean, there are people living in the United States with family from Bangladesh, clear on the opposite end of the world. But an unlikely place that you would think that you would find people of Portuguese heritage, specifically Madeiran, Azorean heritage, it would be in the Caribbean. You know, if you really think about it, sure, there are Madeirans who made it as far as Hawaii and the United States, but you can understand the United States, you know, land of milk and honey, lots of people wanted to go there. You can understand the immigration there. Hawaii, a little bit different, clear on the opposite side of the world from Madeira, but you had a lot of Madeirans who went out there to work in the pineapple groves and so forth. But when it comes to the Caribbean, it's a little, I don't know, I always found it kind of fascinating that an island like Madeira would have contributions, people, you know, contributions to the Caribbean. Well, how did we even arrive there? How did that even happen? Well, I look at it that when it came to Madeira, there were the push factors and I guess you can't say the pull factors, but actually the push factors. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. Um, so how did we even arrive to this? How did Madeira and the Caribbean end up in the same sentence? You know, it's one of those kind of things like you sit down there and you just wonder like, how in the world did something like that happen? So what I like to do, because I'm a history buff, right? So it's not surprising that I'm curious about my own family and the history of my family and so forth. So we have to go back to Madeira to find out what in the world was going on over there to cause Madeirans to end up in the Caribbean. I'm going to try to see if I can make this short because there's a lot of history to pack in. I'm sure I'm going to forget something. But let's go to Madeira around, I want to say, the late 1700s. The island is practically a colony of Portugal at the time. So, they make great wine. Certain crops can grow out there, probably, a little bit more tropical than the mainland. And, they're supplying the mainland Portugal with all these different things. So the island, for the most part, was rather successful. And if you think about the island, it was discovered in 1419, if I'm not mistaken. And when I say discovered, I mean the Portuguese finally found or came upon this island. There were no one living there as far as we know. There may have been people passing through. Seems like there were people who were aware of the island, but there was no established settlement there until the Portuguese showed up. So they come there, and when they began colonizing the island, it happened to be around the same time, or as the island is building up, happened to be around the same time that Spain and Portugal issues decrees to expel their Jewish population. Decrees, mind you. Not only that, you had Genoese merchants who were aware, I guess, who funded expeditions and so forth, because there were people who funded the expedition of the Portuguese explorers who came upon Madeira. And I guess after they get there, word gets back, hey, the island looks this way, the island has this, the island is this, whatever, this is what we're doing. So I guess these merchants, these entrepreneurs saw an opportunity, and it's like, hey, let's go over to this island. Then I think you had some people that came in from Malta, and Malta happened to be a place that's the Mediterranean island. It's either Malta or Cyprus, I forget which one it is, or Sicily, one of those Mediterranean islands. And they're there, and supposedly they were already experts on growing cane. So they bring that crop to Madeira, and it happened to explode and did very well. So from there, the island just went on to just become an agricultural juggernaut, just great soil, great volcanic soil, could grow a lot of stuff. The early explorers cleared out a lot of land, burned up a lot of the forest that was there to clear it out for living, for growing, and for farming, and for their animals to graze and so forth. So now we come all the way up to around the late 1700s. And the island, for as far as I know, it's doing rather well. But then we come over into the early 1800s, and something goes on the mainland. This emperor, or this leader, comes to power in France by the name of Napoleon. And of course, he has the itch for conquest. So he goes around and he starts doing his thing, conquering places in Europe. He had a problem with one group of Europeans, though, and they were offshore, and they were the British. They would just not capitulate to whatever demands he has. They did not want to be conquered by him or have anything to do with him. So the nemesis of England was always Spain. Spain and France and England were always at it, and the Dutch and so forth. So they're going at it. Well, the Portuguese, on the other hand, they aligned themselves with the British. They were trading with the British, had a great relationship with the British that went back hundreds of years prior. And so when Napoleon came through, Napoleon was like telling all of the continental European kingdoms, France is where he was from. He wasn't really from France. I think he was from Sardinia or something like that. But of course, that island was owned by France. So he goes to the other places that he's conquered and said, look, I don't want you doing any business whatsoever with the British. I want to isolate them. I want to starve them out. They don't want to come on board. We're just going to go ahead and just basically isolate them. Portugal, on the other hand, apparently didn't get that memo, and Portugal is still trading with the British. Napoleon says, I don't like that. I want you guys to stop trading with the British. Portugal is looking around like, who are you to tell us what to do? So Spain happens to be an ally of Napoleon at the time. So Napoleon comes down to Spain and he's like, listen, I want to use your place because I want to go over there and teach the Portuguese a lesson. So he comes down, does his thing, whatever he's doing, and he launches his war against the Portuguese. You're going to do what I want you to do, because you would not listen to me, and you would not cut off the British and cut off trade and isolate them like I want them to be isolated. I'm going to take some vengeance on you. He goes down there and he starts carrying on. I shouldn't say him, but his armies get down there, starts carrying on. But eventually, the Spanish now, they were like, you know what? We don't know if we like this guy Napoleon either. They got upset with him and his armies, and they began rebelling against Napoleon. So now you had what we call the Iberian Wars. So needless to say, as this is going on the mainland, you have Madeira out there off the shore, and the Azores, they're offshore. So they're now going to be affected in terms of trade and so forth, because a lot of the products that were grown there on the island would travel to the mainland and used over there for consumption and so forth, the trade going back and forth. But with Napoleon's armies now in Portugal, you figure trade is going to stop. So now the island now is probably going through a kind of a little tough patch. But the good thing about it is that the British started using Madeira as a place for their launching pad to now attack Napoleon. So they're going to use Madeira as a place where they can set up shop, and they could go ahead and launch their attacks or give their assistance to the Spanish and the Portuguese in fighting back or pushing back Napoleon off of the Iberian Peninsula. So, of course, this in itself helps because, war always brings in money and people benefit from this type of stuff. So as this is going on, eventually Napoleon was pushed back, kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula, and pushed back, and he had other big things to worry about, which of course other places were rebelling also, so he had to go ahead and deal with that. So this is Madeira around that time. Now we go up a little further into the 1800s, and there are a couple of world events that's going on. One of them I'm going to mention in passing right now. In 1834, the British Empire decided to end slavery all throughout their empire, from England itself to the Caribbean and wherever else slavery was going on under their flag. They decided to bring it to an end in 1834. So not long after that, a Scottish minister comes down, and he's on his way to India, I think it is, and his wife contracts tuberculosis. His name was, I forgot his name, I think it was Cali was, I think, his last name, if I'm not mistaken. And he decides, as he's going toward India, he's going to stop off at Madeira because, again, England had a long-standing relationship with Portugal. And a lot of British people were aware of Madeira as being a nice little vacation spot you can go to. He gets down there, the weather is great, everything feels good. He figures this would be a nice place for him to stop with his wife. Nice weather, much better weather than in England. Not as gloomy, not as dreary. Brings her down there to try to get her to recover. So while he's there, he's making some observations, and he notices that the island is, at the time, rather impoverished. He realized that the population, a lot of people there were illiterate at the time, and he just felt sorry for the people there. And you have to understand, Madeira is a beautiful island, but you have to understand, back in those days, the terrain is very, very rugged. So I think I read somewhere before where back in those days you had people who were born on one end of the island and never saw Funchal, and people born in Funchal who never saw other parts of the island, just because the terrain, you had to climb a bunch of hills and come down and over and under, and that was not the easiest thing to do back in those days. So Of course, you would have people in Funchal, more like elite people who probably were educated, had good education, but the rural farmers way out in the middle of nowhere, it was a little bit different. So yes, the population was probably, quite a bit of the people were illiterate and so forth. So he comes down there, saw people going through various diseases, and remember, he's a doctor himself. He saw, just all around depressed situation, and it hadn't even gotten as bad as yet. That's coming up next. So he decided to set up shop, open up a small little hospital, I think it was, open up a few schools, and he began teaching and so forth. But one of the things that he was doing was he was also, because he was a Presbyterian minister, and one of the things he was also doing in his teachings was to proselytize, which is more or less teach people or share people about your religion, share to people your religion, your faith, and so forth, and trying to seek converts into this faith. This did not go unnoticed by the dominant Catholic Church, because Portugal was and still is primarily a Catholic country. And they're looking in, and it's like, hey, this guy's muscling in, he's drawing away potential converts, or he's drawing away adherents from our faith over to this new faith, this Presbyterian Protestant faith. And back in those days, it was still illegal to do that on the island or in the country of Portugal. So as he was doing this, they decided, and you know what, before I even get to this, let me stop right there for a minute. Let me go back. I forgot to mention that when England ended slavery in 1834, England kind of came down to Portugal, and I'll explain to you why they did this. It came down to Portugal, and it was like, hey, you know what, can we borrow a few of your laborers, to send to our Caribbean island, our colony known as Trinidad in the Caribbean? And I guess Portugal gave in and said, sure, you can go ahead, have a few. So 38, if I'm not mistaken, 38 people from the Azores boarded a ship right after slavery came to an end in the British Empire. I think slavery came to an end that August, and I think by that September, you had these Azorians heading off to Trinidad. So that was that. They go over there, probably like a pilot test to see how they would fare working down there as laborers on the island of Trinidad. So now we come back forward now to Minister Cali and his converts. So the Catholic Church says, you know what, we don't like what's going on here. And I'm not saying they said these things to him, but it was almost like, before you meet an unfortunate incident, you might want to take your show elsewhere. So before you know it, Minister Cali disguises himself. I guess he seeks refuge at a British, some British home there, by some British bigwig. He hides out, and he boards the ship, and he takes off. And he leaves because he knows his life was probably in danger, So he decides to leave. His converts, the church basically said, look, you guys can't be here practicing this religion, so you guys have got to leave. So before you know it, they were also kicked off the island, and they were shipped off to Trinidad, where a lot of them eventually moved on to the United States and moved on to other places where the Presbyterian Church, I guess, funded or helped these, I guess you can say, religious exiles in their moves and settle them in different places. Okay? So that's that group. Go forward a little further now, and all of a sudden, something hits Madeira that they just did not need happening. Madeira was known for its Madeiran wine. It was known, of course, an agricultural community. So great wine, great climate to grow the grapes needed for the wine, and so forth. But then a blight, a plant disease came and hit those grape vineyards. When it did so, dried up. So here you have an island where its dominant crop, long since the days of sugar, which kind of went out maybe a century earlier or further back. So wine became the dominant crop, and all of us, not the dominant crop, but grapes became the dominant crop to make wine. So it dominated the industry there. So all of a sudden this plant blight comes through, this plant disease comes through, and now everything is dried up. So a lot of people were employed to work in these vineyards. So now you have no grapes or no productive grapes to make your wine. Of course, now it runs a ripple effect. So now the workers lose their job because there's nothing for them to do. You don't have the wine now. You don't have the grapes, fruitful grapes, so to speak, to make the wine. So now your wine factories or the places you make your wine now they have to go out of business, or they're suffering, or there's not much. So now you don't have something to export to the outside world anymore, to bring in the much needed income back to the island. So now you had a lot of people just sitting around having nothing to do. Now, of course, Portugal is an island. Not Portugal, Madeira is an island. So, of course, you have the ocean around you. So there were still ways you can sustain yourself, you know. But for the people who are not living on the coastline, living up in the mountains, living up in the hills, and it's hard to get down to the sea. Because, again, Madeira, beautiful as it is, it's elevated. It's way above the sea level. And you have people living in rural areas, not living near the ocean. So that would create a problem for those people. So all of a sudden now, Portugal has a problem in its hands. You have these islands over there, and these people are struggling. They're suffering. So now they become a burden on your system because they have nothing to do, and they're on the island. So not long after, so around this same time, the British comes down, and they know what's going on. They know that Portugal has a problem in its hands with with Madeira. A lot of people out of work, need something to do, destitute. What are we going to do? The British come down, and one of the things that happened with the British is that when they ended slavery in their empire, a lot of wealthy people, because remember, a lot of British people, British families, became rich off of sugarcane and slavery. So when slavery came to an end, they lost their labor force. They didn't have the people out there to do all that dirty work for them anymore, to grow the sugarcane, to till their farms and their lands and their massive amounts of land and so forth. They didn't have enslaved Africans anymore to do that dirty work for them for free. So because of their wealth and because of their influence, they go to the British government and say, hey, what's up with you guys? How in the world are you ending this thing called slavery? That's how we sustained ourselves. That's how we sustained it, and that's how we were able to provide riches to the empire. So the British government basically looked around us like, yeah, you know, these people have money. They have wealth. They have friends in high places. We've got to capitulate to them in some way. And the first place England looked to, they looked to their old friend Portugal and said, listen, see that you have a lot of destitute people down there on this island. You know, we've been to Madeira. We know what it's like down there. It's beautiful, but you have a lot of people who are now without work, you know, illiterate population for the most part, don't mind doing menial jobs. Can we get some of these people, you know? And Portugal, realizing they can, you know, unload all these burdens on their system, basically said, sure, you can go ahead and take them. So initially, when this thing first started out, as expected, the Madeirans were kind of like, no, I don't know if we want to go do something like this. So they were apprehensive, you know, going to places that they have never heard about. Some of them probably never heard about or knew anything about or knew where it was. But the push factor started to come in when the wine industry just went upside down. And then it happened twice. All of us. So when the first Madeirans went down or left, or they took up the offers to go to these British islands in the Caribbean, including Guyana, which is on the South American mainland, or back in those days British Guyana, they go down there and things didn't initially work out that well. A lot of them died from tropical diseases. You know, they went down there and realized it was hard labor in the hot sun. It wasn't like back in Madeira where the temperature is temperate, where you can get some nice little cool months, you know, where it's a little bit more comfortable to be out in the sun and so forth. You're going to tropical heat down in the Caribbean. A lot of them died. A lot of them just gave up. And a lot of them just walked off the plantations that they were sent to work and just simply said, you know what? Basically, F this, you know, we're out of here. And a lot of them turned to shopkeeping. A lot of them, with their entrepreneurial minds, just basically said, hey, sugarcane, liquor, why don't we make? So a lot of Portuguese, the initial established Portuguese businesses in places like Trinidad and Guyana involve liquor. They had a lot of stores, and so you had the not the enslaved Africans, freed Africans who still were working in the plantations, and then later on you had East Indians coming into places like Guyana, and so both of them are working on in the cane fields, producing the cane. The Portuguese came and the Madeirans came and are like, okay, you know what? We'll take that they're out there doing the hard labor with, and we'll sit here in the shops and we'll buy the liquor or make the liquor, and we'll sell the liquor from the sugarcane, or the rum as they call it, and we'll sell it in our stores. So those Portuguese who survived or who hacked it out or who toughed it out, these are the things they came up with. But because so many people of them were dying, eventually what happened was the British had to bring the thing to an end. It was an indentured servant type contract type of thing, where it was like the Portuguese, these Madeirans signed a contract. You can go and work for us for 7 years. We'll pay you a passage to go there. After 7 years, you can come back home if you want to. But these people are going 2,500 miles, 3,000 miles across the sea. Many of them never came back. And so, while all this was going on, as things began to really, really get tough in Madeira, a lot of Madeirans were like, hey, what can we lose? If I stay home here, I might die from hunger. Might as well go and see what this is really all about. So around the 1860s, right after the big famines in Madeira, 1870s, there was a boom in Madeirans leaving Madeira and heading off to these Caribbean islands. And it was around the 1860s, the 1870s, around that time, somewhere in that vicinity there, that's when my ancestors came from Madeira. I don't know where they may have traveled to first. That's a difficult part for me to find. But they left Madeira and they traveled, perhaps because one of the first ports of embarkation that a lot of them ended up in, the British tend to have some ports in the Caribbean where you had to go first before you went somewhere else. One of those was in Georgetown, in what we call Guyana today. Another place was Port of Spain, Trinidad, and another place was Bridgetown, Barbados. So the smaller islands that the British had, like Antigua, Nevis, St. Kitts, and so forth, most of these people, these Madeirans who were coming in, would travel to those bigger islands, or those ports that I just mentioned, and then from there they may move on to the other small islands. I don't know if that's what happened with my Madeiran ancestors. I don't know, but all I know is that one ended up on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. That is where my mother was born, and one ended up on the island of St. Kitts. That's where my father was born. So it was around that time, somewhere in that vicinity. I don't have much information. That is what I'm researching right now. But if I can guesstimate, looking at the ages of my great-grandfathers or my great-grandparents, you can guesstimate, and you understand that back in those days, people got married rather young, had children rather young. I would say that these are people, the Madeirans that are from my family, came down. I want to say they had these children when they were 20, 19, 21, 22, somewhere around there. Because my grandmother who raised me, my grandmother, my father's mother, who came through a Portuguese person, someone from Madeira, her father, the child of a Portuguese woman, the child of a Madeiran woman, I should say, her father was born in 1879. So if you cut that back and say around 20 years prior, you're looking at about 1859, right? So again, it just looks like that would be around the time when my Madeiran ancestors came. And they probably came to St. Kitts and Nevis during that big explosion of Madeirans who were leaving Madeira and saying, to hell with this place right now, love my island, it's beautiful and everything like that, but things are tough, and the British are offering us employment opportunities on their British Caribbean islands in the Caribbean. So why not take up the opportunity? And they came down. At the time, I guess things were a little bit better, perhaps better medicines for them to deal with the malaria, the yellow fever, whatever they were dying from prior in previous decades. I guess it was a little bit easier for them to now exist there and live out their days. But as I said before, because many of them left from Madeira, and you're traveling thousands of miles over the ocean that may have taken quite a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. I really don't know how long such a journey takes by boat back in those days, but I'm sure it was not an easy feeling, probably seasickness, probably the treacherous waters. And I'm sure a lot of them said, hey, I'm here now. I might as well make a life here. I'm not going back. I'm not going back. So, with that in mind, that is how my family, at least the way I suspect, that they made it over. And neither one of my Madeiran ancestors, that on my mother's side, that on my father's side, as far as we know, ever went back to Madeira. They came over, they had children, all sorts of different things that may have transpired there. But because they never traveled back to Madeira, it seems as though whatever information or whatever knowledge or whatever they would have passed on was either not passed on, or because of families breaking up and all sorts of, the family squabbles and early deaths and so forth, a lot of information was not passed on. So I just need to just point one other thing out. Like, for example, my great-great-grandfather, whose mother was from Madeira, his mother had 2 children with his father, my great-great-grandfather. He was a Frenchman, by the way. And after he had the first 2 children with this Madeiran ancestor of mine, he died. He fell from a horse and broke his neck. This is what was passed down to me in oral history. And after he died, the Madeiran ancestor, my Madeiran ancestor Maria de Jesus, she moves on and she marries someone else. The person she married was a Teixeira, which tells me that he was also most likely from Madeira or of Portuguese descent. And she went on, and apparently she went on to live an entirely different life with other children that she may have had. Whereas her first 2 children, which included my great-great-grandfather, I guess went on to live his life. I don't know what kind of relationship he had with his mother, but then he has my grandmother, my father's mother. And when she was born, she never really had a relationship with him. She was more or less like an outside child, and she never really developed a relationship with him. And by not having a relationship with him, I guess whatever information he would have passed on about his mother was not passed on to my grandmother, who then didn't pass anything on to her children, which would be my father and his siblings. So that's where the dearth of information, or the lack of information that I have, which is why I have to try to piece everything together, not through actual eyewitnesses or not through, through some oral accounts. I have to find other information to corroborate and bring this and make it make sense to me. Over my mother's side, it's a whole other chapter over there. It's a whole other wild story I'll have to tell it another day. But I gave a history, bringing things up to just show you how my Madeiran ancestors made it to the Caribbean. The reasons why, showing you what was going on in Madeira, the tough times that were going on there at the time. Now, of course, that Madeira of the past is a far cry from the Madeira of today. People are far more educated, beautiful island, great infrastructure. The island is seeing some very good days right now. It's not impoverished like it was back then. They don't have to depend on wine anymore as their main economic driving force. There's so many other things that they can do now. So, when I went there a year ago, exactly a year ago last week when I was there, like I mentioned in that first video when my wife and I touched down, it was an amazing feeling. I guess it's the same way we would feel if we went to Africa, or my wife, who's also part Indian. If you go back to a place that your ancestors once walked, your ancestors once lived, cried, shed tears, died, it's a spiritual feeling. And that's how we felt when we went there. Here's an island in the Atlantic Ocean, Northeast Atlantic Ocean, 3,000 miles away from anything that we know, us coming from the Caribbean region. And we get to this island, and we're looking around and realizing that, wow, my great-great-grandmother lived here, was born here. My great-great-grandfather was born here, lived here. My wife, her great-great-grandfather came from here, walked these streets, walked these grounds, breathed this air. And here we are coming years later as descendants of these people and walking the same land. It was just really just an amazing feeling. Anyway, this video, again, I just babbled on. Pick whatever you want to pick out of it that says Okay, I like that, or whatever. Hopefully I kept it interesting. There's a lot more that I could say, a lot more that I'm thinking of right now, but I'm not going to extend this video any longer. I'm just going to keep it right where it is right here. If you have any comments, you have any questions, you can put that down in the comment section, obviously. I'll be glad to hear from you guys, okay? I really appreciate the interaction I have with you guys down there. That shouldn't say I appreciate. I really welcome when you guys put the comments down there, because I love to go down there and interact with you guys, okay? Anyway, you guys take care. Until the next video, which could be tomorrow, which could be next week, or 2 months from now, I don't know. But for right now, I'll just stop it here, okay? You guys take care, and thank you for tuning in to this channel, Mad About Madeira. You can share, you can like. I would really appreciate it, okay? Take care.